So, the structure of this keynote is a three-part structure. By way of introduction, I'll briefly talk about historical recreation in jazz and popular music, a bit of classical music as well, just kind of sweeping overview. Before I'll focus and dedicate most of my time to discussing two case studies, two of my own case studies. One that is, as Umut already mentioned, a recreation of an Ellington performance, and another one where I was not actually participating, which focuses on a Beatles tribute band, which has a very unique approach to recreating the Beatles. And then I'll close off with some reflections on historical recreation as a method. So again, this is a very broad, sweeping history, very generic terms, ignoring all of the debates and definitions and polemics really that surround historical recreation. And in this particular instance, I also focus on historical recreation in performance practice, so really kind of a practice-based approach. So historically informed performance, as it is better known in the classical world, has a rather long history, but it really came into its own in the 20th century. Second half of the 20th century mostly, and we see that there is a very strong presence of this particular historical movement in our region, so to speak, in Western Europe. We think of famous names, many of them still around, still performing in some cases. Jordi Savall, for example, Ton Koopman, John Eliot Gardner's Orchestre de la Révolution Romantique. These are all examples. Now, most of these examples are specifically at first started by focusing on Baroque music. But gradually it spread basically in both directions, both historical directions, with first more focus on Renaissance music, early classicism, and so on. But nowadays, basically, you have this movement of historically informed performance covering virtually all eras. In classical music, it is a performance approach, but also a research approach. Despite of all the polemics, it's quite an accepted kind of approach, and you can still go out there. Well, no, you can't. But we used to be able to go out there and watch many of these orchestras do this live on stage. This is less so the case in popular music, where it's really kind of not perceived as historically informed performance. It's also not perceived as historical recreation, but a very kind of popular thing is the tribute act, which in effect is a kind of historical recreation. This tribute act or tribute acts really revolve around kind of key bands and key performers, mostly of what many think of as the golden age of popular music, 1960s, 1980s. So on the photograph you see a whole lot of lead, which obviously is a Led Zeppelin tribute act. We also have Björn again, which is an ABBA tribute act. We all know the kind of Elvis actors and so on. However, in popular music, it's mostly a kind of performance concept. There is a little bit of research surrounding tribute acts, but really as a kind of cultural phenomenon, so not as a method or a kind of philosophical thing as in Western classical music. In jazz, we kind of see a similar thing. It's also more thought of as a tribute act and not as a kind of historical informed performance. There's actually even less examples. There's very few kind of durable bands. There are some experiments now and then, but very few durable bands. Vince Giordano, for example, if you have a Hollywood movie and you need 1920s, 1930s jazz music, it's probably him. You're gonna hear him and his band, which you can see on the photo there. Or Wynton Marsalis and his Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, they also have a kind of historical approach. And for most of these bands, the focus now lies on, again, the golden age, but the golden age of jazz, which is kind of by many seen as the pre-1940s, early jazz, swing, etc. So there's not a lot of literature around. It's also not often used as a research method. And obviously, I aim to contribute to the little literature that there is. For example, with this first case, recreating Ellington, an Ellington big band performance, both live and in the studio. But the focus for me really lied on Jimmy Blanton, as he was the main focus of my PhD. Who is Jimmy Blanton? Obviously, to begin with, he is generally seen as one of the most important bassists in jazz history. He's best known for his 2-year tenure with band leader, composer, and pianist Duke Ellington. And in these 2 years because obviously, as you can see, he didn't live very long, in these 2 years, he was heavily featured by Ellington within the band. There's several series of piano-bass duets, which were really kind of the first such duets in a jazz context. There are several orchestral showcases, kind of mini concerti for bass and big band, so to speak. And then some solo spots here and there, like an 8-bar introduction, a 4-bar interlude, etc. So this was not the first time that a bassist was giving solo space in a jazz context, but it is arguably the first time that a bassist is so heavily featured, really kind of seen as one of the stars in the orchestra. Relatively shortly after his untimely death in 1942, age of 23, he became what jazz scholars call a jazz icon, which, as Tony Whiten writes, is an uncritical object of devotion that is treated in uncomplicated terms so that the frictions, contradictions, and problematic aspects of their lives and music are ironed out into one straightforward, homogeneous narrative. So several of the myths and the told stories and the anecdotes and so on, I researched into in my PhD research, both in terms of his biography as his musical legacy. And one of the focus points that I had that was treated in uncomplicated terms is a musical one. It is his tone. So when I did a reception study of Blanton, I noticed that his tone was consequently described with following terms: astonishingly full, outsized, resonant, roaring, huge. So I noticed that the common factor in this was that they all seem to refer to the intensity of the sound, so the volume. So obviously my next step in this kind of analysis was determining, okay, so if that is something that really makes him stand out, what could be the cause? What are the impact factors of volume on a string bass? So that could be right hand, it could be the left hand, could be his instrument, could be the way the bass is positioned live on stage or within the studio. Or it could be technology here understood to be the kind of electronical devices that aid in the production of sound. In this context, I won't be discussing his right and left hand, also not his instrument. All these factors I did research and factor into the final results. But I will be focusing on his placement, his spatialization, if you will, within the studio and live context, and any possible, if any, technological aids that might have been used. Now, when we think of technology or technological aids in the context of a string bass, an acoustic bass, double bass, whatever you want to call it, the first thing that comes to mind is actually bass amplification. So again, a brief and sweeping overview of bass amplification. So roughly from the late 1960s to today, we see that bass amplification is an intricate combination of a pickup, a microphone, a dedicated microphone, an amplifier, a PA system, often a DI too, the mixing disc, which then goes into the PA system, and so on. So a whole complete setup. Now, this is relatively new because between the 1950s and the late 1960s, we see that the only type of amplification really was a microphone, just a basic microphone which now was plugged into a PA system. And before the 1950s, there are basically no technological aids at all. It's just a bassist left for himself or herself at the back of the band. And so this really relied on more or less two aspects. That's the strength and sensitivity. So strength really meaning his or her own capability to project, to handle that bass in such a way that it accurately projects. And sensitivity relies on the rest of the band, really adjusting to each other. Drums has a key role in it. If the drums plays loud, the rest of the band will play loud. But they were really used to playing in this acoustic setting and really used to adapting. It's much more difficult nowadays in a big band. It's all extremely loud because basically everything is amplified. But that in those days was less of an issue, even to that extent that in big ballrooms where you could have 2,000, 4,000 even people dancing, you could still hear the big band playing completely acoustically and the bass, not to the same level as we expect nowadays, but still. So obviously the next step in my analysis was, does this apply to Blanton too? Well, I don't know if something strikes you, but these are just a few photos of Blanton in the band. And the first thing that struck me is that he's actually in the front of the band. He's not at the back. So that might be a first clue, the positioning of the bass. The second clue kind of automatically evolves from that, and that is that he's fairly close to the soloist's microphone. So in the studio, maybe there's 2 or 3 microphones, live setting. Very often there was just a single microphone that was shared for announcing duties, for singing, for the soloist who all alternated, stepping to the front in front of that microphone. But that particular frontline position of Blanton places him within mere feet of this soloist's microphone. And if I compare this with photos of other swing bands, this position really was more of an exception than a rule. So from this I formulated my hypothesis, being the frontline position and the proximity to the soloist's microphone really enables Blanton to have a forceful, voluminous projection, more so than his peers, than his other fellow bassists. But obviously a hypothesis needs testing. And that is where the historical recreational part kicks in, so to speak. In 2015, I undertook an experimental recording session in which I tried to recreate the historical conditions to the best of our efforts and mimic the original circumstances of a late 1930s, early 1940s big band recording. So what are these aspects? To begin with, the big band, a slightly different orchestration or instrumentation rather than we have today in big bands. Acoustic guitar, for example, no amplification, acoustic bass, obviously, and so on. Repertoire also, I chose 2 compositions that brought out different aspects of Blanton's bass playing, not just his soloing, but also his accompanying, and so on. The location, that's a funny one. It really is a converted shed. This is the actual location we used. Doesn't look anything like a modern-day recording studio, which obviously wouldn't work because modern-day recording studios are dead spaces. Everything is done post-production, and the sound needs to be as dead as possible. This is a lively space, so to speak. And you might think, well, wow, that's really basic, really primitive. But it's not too far from the truth. This is an actual photograph of a little bit before Blanton joined the band. This is 37, but you see it's bare brick walls. The band is in one space together. You can see maybe the singer in the back of the band next to the drums. She wears her jacket, so it must have been cold there. So it really is that primitive. It really was that primitive. So that space kind of worked. Then the recording setup, obviously no effects, no mixing, direct to disc. The only thing we had, and which is historically accurate, was live volume mixing. So you could actually have the engineers mix up the volume, which I obviously asked them to not do. And then we used historically accurate ribbon microphones, 1 or 2, depending on the context. Finally, performance practice, which in this case means asking the band, which, by the way, was the Brussels Jazz Orchestra, which is Belgian and by extension one of Europe's finest big bands, to actually, somewhat counterintuitively for them, perform the same improvisations as on the original. Obviously, if they would play something entirely different, this might obscure the sound of the bass. So I tried out 3 different kind of setups. So those 3 setups you see here, and the difference between all of those is obviously the positioning of the bass and the positioning of the microphone. These 3 setups are based on historical photographs, and the idea was to find out if there is any difference in how the bass projects on record anyways. So for the sake of time, the first 2 ones I'm gonna skip. Basically, they did not yield the result I was looking for. Obviously, I did discuss them and try to explain what happened in those setups. But the 3rd setup actually was the one that brought the result that I hoped for, that kind of confirmed the hypothesis. And as you may see from the diagram, this is indeed the exact same setup as Blanton was positioned in. We're now going to listen, if it is okay. I'm looking at my technician. Well, he's not mine, but he's our technician. And we're first going to listen to the original 1940 master take of one of the 2 songs that I also recorded called Jack the Bear. It's one of those bass concerti, so to speak, for Blanton, written specifically for Blanton. And just a little snippet, the opening of Jack the Bear, so you can hear that bass very nicely come out in a solo. And then afterwards, we're going to listen to the recreation. So this is the 1940 version. And then we have our 2015 recreation. Voila. So I'm not sure you heard it because, of course, when you're listening at home through those tiny computer boxes and whatnot, this may not come true, but, well, I guess you'll just have to believe me that this yielded the results we wanted. So this is just to give you somewhat of an idea of how I approached, in a kind of participatory way, a historical recreation in jazz. But let's move on from jazz to more broadly popular music in this second case study. So by the way, with popular music studies really thinks of music in a very broad way, everything between ragtime and EDM. Some include jazz in there too. I would also, but just for the sake of my argument, I now kind of separated them. But I think everyone agrees that no matter what your definition of popular music is, the Beatles obviously squarely fall into that definition. So, as I have mentioned before, I will focus now on a sound-alike tribute band, Beatles tribute band from the Netherlands, a band called the Analogs. I guess I don't have to start by explaining who the Beatles were. Okay, I see everyone at home nodding. Well, I don't see you, but I just hope you're all nodding. So let's immediately talk about Beatle tribute bands. So this type of tribute is extremely popular. It's really a kind of global phenomena. I guess every country in the world has at least one tribute band. Ian English, back in 2006, estimated that there were over 600 professional Beatle tribute bands. That number has undoubtedly grown exponentially. And some countries are, of course, have more tribute bands, like the United States has over 200, United Kingdom over 75, Japan has over 60, and so on. The origins of these kind of Beatle tribute bands date back to the late 1970s. And for example, in 1980, the bootleg Beatles were launched, and you can actually see the bootleg Beatles on there. So this is a British tribute band that still exists today, and that kind of forms the blueprint, the archetype, if you will, of many Beatle tributes. So what is this archetype? Very broadly speaking, there is this very select type of repertoire, only the hits, so to speak, for Beatle fans out there, the blue and the red albums, really. Moreover, many tribute bands, Beatle tribute bands anyways, dedicate much attention to visual mimicry. So painstakingly copying not just the iconic dress style of the Beatles, but also their hairdo, the famous mop tops, their instruments, even the Scouse accent and the Liverpudlian accent. And the bootleg Beatles are, of all of these factors, are a prime example of this. So in a broad typology of Beatle tributes, this is called the look-alike. But obviously that's not the only type of tribute band. Another one, which I call the Bender band, is also quite common. Why Bender band? Because they basically transgress the ideological boundaries between genre, gender, race and ethnicity, often also age. So an example of this is the band Beatallica. You can see an album of Beatallica there, and the famous Beatallica album Hell. What Beatallica offers is what you basically can expect it offers by its name, a sonic and visual mashup of the Beatles and Metallica songs, styles, looks, and so on. Or, for example, a gender bender band, the Sheetles, which is an all-female tribute. This type is also quite common. It comes in many different variants. Some are parodies, some are really kind of creative and masterful reinterpretations of the original Beatles repertoire. And finally, the least common type, which is the sound-alike. Again, the name kind of explains what it is. They don't dress up as their idols. They don't care about looking the same like the Pepper outfit. But they do aim to replicate the music, the sounding music, as close to the original as possible. And the Analogs, my case study, is exactly such a band. So the Analogs is a Beatle tribute created fairly late in 2014. The drummer and founder, Fred Gehring, was frustrated by seeing so many Beatle tributes that only played those hits, neglecting so much of the music that was recorded after 1966. Why 1966? Because in August 1966, the Beatles made the decision to stop touring and performing live. So in effect, they became a studio-only band, quite a rarity. This allowed them, obviously, to take full advantage of everything the studio and studio technology had to offer. And they began experimenting with all kinds of effects and sounds and samples and unusual instruments and whatnot. Now, for the Beatles themselves, this was never an issue. They never had to play this live, but for tribute bands, this poses near insurmountable obstacles, as all of these effects and sounds are really difficult to replicate live on stage. But it is exactly this that the Analogs put central to their mission, to perform the post-1966 albums, and I quote, in their entirety, precisely as the records were made at the time, using the same vintage instruments, sounds, live strings and horns, just the music as recorded by the Beatles in the 60s, only live. So in every year they dedicate a tour to one particular album, and you can see Magical Mystery Tour, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the White Album, and then finally Abbey Road, which unfortunately was interrupted by the pandemic. So a little bit more about their mission. Now the focus for them lies on historically accurate sound production, beginning of course with the historically correct instruments. It begins with the proper type of amplifier, of guitar, of drums. But this is fairly easy. These instruments are still being made, still being played. Also, lookalike bands like to use these instruments, so they're plentiful. Now, when we switch to keyboards, for example, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Some are fairly mainstream. A harpsichord, a Hammond organ, you can find these instruments. To tour with them is maybe another matter, but it's still fairly easy. But then there are the vintage and extremely rare, at least in working condition, instruments, like the Mellotron, the Lowry Heritage Deluxe, like really specialized instruments, very often instruments that have one particular kind of sound, but obviously a sound that is crucial to one particular song and to the recreation of that song. On top of that, they use what, could be described as miscellaneous instruments. For example, on Maxwell Silver Hammer on Abbey Road, we have a blacksmith anvil that is being used, and you can see one of the analogs actually playing that anvil there. Or on a number of songs, there are instruments from the Indian Carnatic tradition. So it's sitar, tabla, tanpura, diluruba, swarmandala, etc. And a famous example is Within You, Without You from the Pepper album. You can see the band with guest musicians for these most of these Indian instruments. So as you can imagine, this is a huge production. For example, for the White Album, which granted is a double album, 30 tracks, no less than 57 different instruments were used, all in one show on stage. So let us just listen to some music. Now, I'm not going to play the original Beatles track because we will immediately be kicked out of YouTube. But I do hope that we get to listen to a little bit of the recreation of the 1967 song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because this is a song that has that typical mellotron on there, a rare and kind of unique British early analog synthesizer, so to speak. And we're going to listen to the recreation by the Analogs live on stage 50 years after the original version. Okay. So now moving on to their particular type of historical recreation. Now, in this context, in the context of an article I wrote on them, I kind of used the term technologically informed performance because their whole approach to recreation hinges, for such an amazing part, on technology. As you'll notice in just a moment. Obviously, my own recreation of Blanton and Ellington also hinged on technology, but this is even to much larger extent. So the preparatory process, to begin finding sources, they use photographs, they use video clips to determine which instruments are being used. They even have some kind of weird sources, really. I mean, who uses a video game to recreate music? Well, the analogs do. The Beatles Rock Band 2009 video game is one of the sources that they use. More about that in a moment. But the biggest source, obviously, is the record itself. Not meaning the master tapes; they're somewhere safely in a safe in London. But the CDs, often digitized, obviously, of the music. Now, it's important to know that there are no scores or parts available of the music of the Beatles. So that is not your main source. You actually have to begin by creating the music, so to speak, before you can recreate any of it. So it begins by determining the parts. Some of the parts are fairly easy to recreate. The Beatles Rock Band already have some of their parts because it's part of the game design. But for most of it, you actually have to go and get to the original source, the music itself. Starts by repeated listening, but rather than notate it, as we would do when we do a transcription in jazz, for example, they learn it by ear. By trial and error, just play and replay along with the music until they are certain that they have the exact part. Now, a part is just an element of the music. How do you know that all the parts together, combined, sound like the actual record? Well, then they re-record those parts into a software program called Pro Tools. And this allows them to see that the part indeed, or all the parts combined, indeed match with the master take. This is also important for the next step, for the rehearsal, because they will not give notated parts to the band members. They will send out individual parts, the audio files of those parts, and then the band will learn those parts by ear and by heart. The strings, the horns, guest musicians, they're often classically trained, so they will use notated parts. And this eventually ends with a performance live on stage, a complete album reconstructed. So that's kind of the overview of my two case studies. Thought it was interesting to use those two. They have many similarities. So obviously, both of them are very much informed by technology. There's also a lot of differences. For this reason, I will not draw any definite conclusions, but to close, I will offer some reflections on historical recreation as a method. So while in jazz and popular music, there are many bands dedicated to performing a historical repertoire or paying tribute to historical artists, only a few really employ this kind of historical recreational approach, which is logical. It's economically, technically, and practically not always feasible to do that. In research, it's very much underused, but I think it is rather useful. So, historical recreation as a method. I know that my focus lied on music here, but to kind of broaden it up to other disciplines, I think it's very discipline specific. What I say doesn't necessarily apply to visual arts, for example. It is also not a standalone method most of the time. I always combine it with other methods, with interviewing, with participant observation, with autoethnography, for example. And that kind of helps you to make sense of the historical recreation in itself. As I've shown with the example of the Beatles and the analogs, you don't need to be an active participant, meaning an active performer, to actually get results from using historical recreation. And then finally, I must say that very often, the product is always cool. It's cool to have this record of yourself playing with the Brussels Jazz Orchestra, playing Ellington. But it really more is about the process. It's about trying to make sense of how they get to a particular point. Okay, I'll just end on that note and hope that, again, also the focus light mostly on music. There's something of use for everyone, something that may inspire you or your research.